Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I whispered those words to myself, a ritual to calm my racing heart, to steady my trembling hands. But tonight, my voice wavered, barely a breath against the storm of emotions raging inside me. I was a wreck, a tangled mess of feelings threatening to spill over, and I needed to tell you about something so shocking, so raw that it shattered the foundation of everything I thought I knew. You might not believe me, but I swear every word is true. It all started with a single unexpected invitation, a moment that set my world ablaze with a fire I didn't know I could feel. I'm Elise, 40, living in a charming sun-drenched apartment in the heart of San Diego, where the air always carries the faint tang of ocean salt and the distant hum of the city's vibrant energy. My apartment is my sanctuary, with its whitewashed walls, potted succulents, and a balcony that overlooks the Pacific, where I often sip my morning coffee and watch the waves crash against the shore. I've built a life here, one I thought was unshakable, married to Daniel, 42, for 20 years, a man whose steady presence once felt like my rock in a chaotic world. But lately, I'd been battling a creeping unease, a gnawing doubt that whispered in the back of my mind whenever Daniel was away. His late nights at the tech startup had become more frequent, his laughter more strained, his touch more distant. I told myself it was just the pressure of his new role, but the doubt clung to me like a shadow, cold and relentless. That evening, I was lounging on the balcony, a glass of crisp white wine in my hand, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the tiled floor. It was a balmy Saturday night, the kind where the city buzzed with life, but I was content to stay in, the faint sound of seagulls and distant laughter drifting up from the beach below. I'd slipped into a sleek, emerald green dress, the fabric hugging my curves in a way that made me feel both elegant and alive, a small act of defiance against the heaviness in my chest. Daniel had been working late again, but tonight was different. He'd texted to say his boss, Julian, 55, had invited us to a private dinner at a cliffside restaurant overlooking the ocean. "It's important," Daniel had said, his tone clipped, and to my surprise, I was expected to join them. I'd met Julian a few times before, always in formal settings, company events, client meetings, that sort of thing. He was a man who exuded power, tall and broad-shouldered, with jet black hair streaked with silver and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through you. He had a magnetic charm, the kind that made people hang on his every word, but there was always a sharpness to him, a sense that he was holding something back, a secret simmering just beneath the surface. I wasn't particularly thrilled about the dinner. Daniel's work events were often stiff, filled with forced smiles and tech jargon, but I wanted to support him, so I agreed, my fingers lingering on the neckline of my dress as I tried to shake the unease that had settled in my bones. When we arrived at the restaurant, the cliffside terrace was a vision of elegance, flickering lanterns casting a warm glow, the ocean stretching out in a shimmering expanse below, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of sea salt and blooming bougainvillea. The table was set for 3, not 4, and I noticed it immediately, a flicker of curiosity sparking in my chest. "Where's your wife?" I asked Julian as we took our seats, my voice light but tinged with suspicion. He flashed a smile, but it faltered for a fleeting moment, a crack in his polished facade. "She's away," he said smoothly, his voice a deep, velvety rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. "Visiting her family in Paris? It's just the 3 of us tonight." A waiter appeared, pouring a deep amber wine into our glasses, the liquid catching the lantern light in a way that made it glow like molten gold. For a while, the conversation was predictable. Work, the startup's latest project, the usual. Julian's presence was commanding, his laughter rich and warm, but there was an edge to it, a calculated intensity that made my skin prickle. Daniel seemed at ease, his hand resting lightly on mine under the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a tension simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Somewhere between the appetizers, a delicate shrimp ceviche that burst with citrus on my tongue, and the main course, Julian shifted the conversation, his tone changing, becoming slower, more deliberate. "I have to say, Daniel," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, his gray eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You're a fortunate man." Daniel chuckled, squeezing my hand, his touch warm but fleeting. "I know," he replied, his voice light, but Julian's gaze lingered on me, a second too long, a heat in his eyes that made my breath catch. "A woman like Elise," he continued, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. "Radiant, sharp, and still breathtaking at 40. That's a rare gem." My cheeks flushed, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore, the compliment catching me off guard. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, slow and deliberate, as if he wanted them to linger in the air, to settle between us like a whispered promise. Daniel laughed, brushing it off. "You're flattering her, Julian," he said, but Julian's smile was sharp, a predator's grin that made my stomach twist. "Maybe," he replied, taking a slow sip of wine, his eyes never leaving mine. "Or maybe I'm just being honest." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was steering it somewhere specific, his words and glances laced with an intention I couldn't quite grasp. By the time dessert arrived, a decadent mango sorbet that melted on my tongue, I was on edge, my nerves frayed, though I couldn't pinpoint why. That's when Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his presence suddenly overwhelming, the air around us thickening with a charged intensity. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while now," he said, his voice low, steady, a timbre that sent a shiver down my spine. "Something unconventional." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his hand stilling on mine, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "Unconventional?" he echoed, his voice tinged with curiosity. Julian's gaze flickered to me, a smoldering heat in his eyes, before returning to Daniel. "You know," he said, his tone smooth, almost hypnotic, "as we get older, life starts to feel predictable, routine, and sometimes breaking that routine, stepping outside of what's expected, can be exhilarating." I shifted in my seat, my stomach tightening, a cold dread washing over me despite the warm night air. There was a weight in his words, something unspoken but heavy with implication, and I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me with its intensity. Daniel frowned, his grip on my hand loosening slightly. "I'm not sure I follow," he said, his voice cautious, a flicker of unease in his hazel eyes. Julian exhaled as if carefully choosing his next words, his gaze steady, unyielding. "I respect you, Daniel," he said, his voice a low rumble that made my skin tingle. "And I respect your marriage. But let's just say I've always believed that certain boundaries can be flexible if the circumstances are right." A silence fell over the table, thick and suffocating, the distant sound of the ocean a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside me. My pulse quickened, a sharp breath catching in my throat. I knew instinctively that whatever Julian was about to say next would change the course of the night. Then he looked me right in the eyes, his gaze piercing, a smoldering intensity that made my heart race, and said, "What if, just once, we let those boundaries bend?" The air in my lungs turned to ice, my fingers tightening around the stem of my wine glass until I thought it might snap. My mind reeled, a cold wave rushing through my body despite the warm glow of the lanterns. I could see Daniel processing the words, his expression frozen in a mix of confusion and shock, his hand slipping from mine entirely. And in that moment, all I could think was, what does he expect us to say? "I'm sorry, Julian," Daniel said, his voice sharp, a tremor of disbelief beneath the surface. "But I think I need you to clarify what exactly you mean." Julian leaned back in his chair, a slow, knowing smile forming on his lips, his confidence unshaken, as if this kind of conversation was as natural to him as discussing the weather. "I meant exactly what I said," he replied, his voice smooth, a sultry edge that made my skin prickle. "A change in perspective, a break from the expected." My stomach twisted, a cold dread washing over me. Was he really suggesting what I thought he was? I glanced at Daniel, hoping, praying he would shut this down, draw a hard line in the sand, but he just sat there, silent, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. That silence unsettled me more than Julian's words, a sharp pang of fear piercing my chest. I'm not sure what you're expecting here, I said finally, my voice measured but firm, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. Julian exhaled, a faint amusement in his expression, his gray eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. No expectations, he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. Just an idea. His gaze flickered between me and Daniel, a smoldering intensity that made my breath hitch. You've been married for 20 years, haven't you? He asked, his tone casual but laced with intent. Daniel nodded cautiously, his hand resting on the table, his fingers twitching slightly. 20, he replied, his voice low, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Julian smiled again, a slow, deliberate grin that made my stomach churn. That's a long time, he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. A beautiful thing, really. But long marriages, they evolve, don't they? People change, desires change. Sometimes keeping a spark alive means stepping outside of what's comfortable. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse roaring in my ears, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. So, you're saying you think we should shake things up? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, a tremor of fear beneath the surface. Julian tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, unyielding, a heat in his eyes that made my skin tingle. I'm saying, he replied, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down my spine, that sometimes sharing something or someone you love doesn't have to be a loss. It can be an experience. A sharp breath caught in my throat, the insinuation clear now, no more room for misinterpretation. He was talking about me, about my marriage, about some kind of arrangement, something I had never even considered. I turned to Daniel, my eyes searching his face for a reaction, for some kind of rejection, some firm boundary that said we weren't the kind of couple who entertained such things. But instead of anger or disgust, there was something else in his expression. Hesitation, uncertainty, a flicker of curiosity that made my stomach clench. Daniel, I said, my voice softer than I intended, a quiet plea, a desperate hope that he would shut this down, that he would choose us over whatever twisted idea Julian had planted in his mind. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply, his movements tense, almost pained. Julian, he said finally, his voice low, a tremor of uncertainty beneath the surface. I don't know what you think our marriage is like, but you haven't said no, Julian interrupted smoothly, setting his empty glass down with a quiet clink, his eyes twinkling with a confidence that made my blood run cold. Not yet. Daniel fell silent again, and I could feel the tension thickening around us, a suffocating fog that pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling in my lap. Why wasn't he shutting this down? Why was there hesitation at all? Look, Julian continued, his voice gentle but insistent, a warmth in his tone that made my skin tingle. I'm not trying to offend anyone. This isn't about disrespecting your marriage, quite the opposite. It's about redefining limits, about seeing if those limits even exist in the first place. My breath felt shallow, the restaurant's soft music now sounding distant, almost distorted, as if the entire world had narrowed down to this moment, to this table, to the impossible situation Julian had placed in front of us. Then, just as casually as he had started this conversation, Julian reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and slid it across the table toward Daniel. Just think about it, he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. If curiosity wins out over certainty, you know where to find me. Daniel stared at the card, unmoving, his expression unreadable, a storm brewing in his hazel eyes. I didn't dare look at it, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold dread washing over me. I had heard of men like Julian before, powerful, influential, so accustomed to getting what they wanted that they made the most outrageous suggestions sound perfectly rational. But I had never thought I'd be sitting across from one, let alone be the subject of his interest. I needed air. I needed to get out of there. Pushing my chair back, I stood up abruptly, my pulse hammering in my ears, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice sharp, a tremor of anger beneath the surface. Julian didn't look surprised, his smile unwavering, a predator's grin that made my stomach churn. "Fair enough," he said, raising his hand slightly, as if in surrender. "No pressure, just an idea." Daniel finally stirred, shaking himself from whatever daze had taken hold of him, his movements tense, almost frantic. "Yeah, I think we should go," he muttered, shoving the untouched card back toward Julian, his voice low, a flicker of regret in his eyes. I didn't wait. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the stone floor, barely registering the curious glances of the other diners as I stepped out into the night. The cool ocean breeze hit my face like a slap, the scent of salt and bougainvillea a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. I heard Daniel's footsteps behind me, quick and uneven, and I expected him to be just as shaken, just as horrified by what had happened. But when he finally spoke, his words sent a fresh wave of shock through me, a cold dread washing over me. "Do you think he was serious?" he asked, his voice low, a tremor of curiosity beneath the surface. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I turned to face my husband, searching his expression, hoping, praying that I had misheard him. But the look in his eyes told me I hadn't, a flicker of uncertainty, a whisper of something more that made my stomach clench. And in that moment, I realized something even more shocking than Julian's proposal. Daniel wasn't just disturbed by what Julian had suggested, he was considering it. The ride home was painfully silent, the hum of the car's engine a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles white, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, my arms crossed, my mind still reeling from what had happened. Julian's words echoing in my head like a haunting refrain. Sometimes, keeping a spark alive means stepping outside of what's comfortable. I felt sick, a cold dread washing over me, my hands trembling in my lap as I tried to make sense of it all. The moment we stepped inside our apartment, I kicked off my heels, the cool, tiled floor a stark contrast to the heat in my chest. I turned to face Daniel, my heart hammering, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. "Tell me you're not actually thinking about this," I said, my voice sharp, a tremor of anger beneath the surface, a desperate hope that he would shut down the idea entirely. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck, his movements tense, almost pained. He hesitated, and that hesitation sent a chill down my spine, a cold dread washing over me. "I don't know," he admitted finally, meeting my eyes, a flicker of uncertainty in his hazel gaze. That admission hit me like a punch to the gut, a sharp pang of pain piercing my chest. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling at my sides. "Daniel," I said, my voice cracking, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. "I don't know what's going through your head right now, but the fact that you didn't shut it down immediately—" I shook my head, unable to finish the sentence, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. He sighed, stepping closer, his expression a mix of frustration and regret. "It caught me off guard, okay?" he said, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. "I wasn't expecting it." "Neither was I snapped, my voice breaking, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. "But I didn't sit there considering it. What is there to think about, Daniel? This isn't us." He looked away for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he sat down heavily on the couch, his shoulders slumping, a weariness in his posture that made my heart ache. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know. Maybe Julian's right about some things." I stared at him, my stomach twisting, a cold dread washing over me. "Right about what?" I demanded, my voice trembling, a sharp pang of fear piercing my chest. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands, his movements tense, almost pained. "We've been married for 20 years, Elise," he said, his voice low, a tremor of uncertainty beneath the surface. "We love each other. We have a good life, but don't tell me you haven't felt it, the routine, the predictability." He glanced up at me, his expression cautious, a flicker of vulnerability in his hazel eyes. "It's not bad, but it's not the same as it used to be." I folded my arms, my pulse racing, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. "So your solution is this?" I asked, my voice sharp, a tremor of anger beneath the surface. "No, that's not what I'm saying," he said quickly, his voice rising, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "I don't even know what I'm saying. Julian made me think about things I've never even considered before." I shook my head, my chest tightening, a sharp pang of pain piercing my heart. "I can't believe this," I whispered, my voice breaking, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated, his movements tense, almost frantic. "Elise, I'm not saying I want to do it," he said, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. I want to understand why the idea bothers me this much." I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, like I had stepped into some alternate version of my marriage where my husband was entertaining something I couldn't even fathom. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, my hands trembling at my sides. "Daniel," I said, my voice soft but firm, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. "I don't know what's happening in your head right now, but let me make one thing clear. I'm not interested." He nodded quickly, his expression softening, a flicker of relief in his hazel eyes. "I know," he said, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. "And that's enough for me." "Is it?" I challenged, my voice trembling, a sharp pang of fear piercing my chest. "Because you keep saying you're just thinking, but what if thinking turns into curiosity, and curiosity turns into something else?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples, his movements tense, almost pained. "I love you, Elise," he said, his voice raw, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. "I don't want to lose what we have." "Then don't risk it," I said softly, my voice laced with hurt, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Because even considering it changes things." He looked up at me, something unreadable in his eyes, a flicker of regret crossing his features. "I don't want to change us," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. I searched his face, looking for the man I had always trusted, the man I had built a life with. He was still there, but now, so was doubt, and for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't sure if love alone would be enough. The next few days were tense, filled with unspoken words and hesitant glances, the air between us heavy with the weight of what had happened. Daniel tried to act normal, brewing coffee in the morning, asking about my day, but there was a distance between us, a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, even though Daniel had said he wasn't interested. I knew the thought had lingered in his mind longer than it should have, and that alone made me question everything: our marriage, our trust, our future. On Thursday evening, I sat alone on the balcony, a glass of wine in my hand, the city's skyline glittering in the distance, the sky melting into warm hues of coral and violet. I had spent the entire week replaying that night at the restaurant, obsessing over every moment, every glance, every pause. The warm breeze kissed my skin, the scent of salt and bougainvillea a faint comfort against the storm inside me. Daniel finally stepped outside, hesitating before sitting beside me, his presence a quiet weight that made my heart ache. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice soft, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling around the glass, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. "I've been thinking," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, a tremor of hurt beneath the surface. He nodded, waiting, his hazel eyes searching mine, a flicker of vulnerability in his gaze. I turned to face him, my heart pounding, a sharp pang of fear piercing my chest. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling, "I need to know. Why did you hesitate that night? Why didn't you shut it down immediately? He looked away, gripping his hands together, his movements tense, almost pained. I told you, he said, his voice low, a tremor of regret beneath the surface. I was caught off guard. That's not the whole truth, I pressed, my voice sharp, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. You thought about it. He swallowed hard, then met my gaze, his hazel eyes filled with a raw honesty that made my heart ache. Yeah, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. I did. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, a sharp pang of pain piercing my chest, even though I had already known it. I don't know why, he continued, his voice raw, a tremor of regret beneath the surface. Maybe it was the way Julian framed it, like it was something normal, something couples do when they've been together as long as we have. And for a split second, I wondered, is there something we're missing? I set my glass down, folding my arms, my pulse racing, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. And now? I asked, my voice trembling, a sharp pang of fear piercing my chest. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders slumping, a weariness in his posture that made my heart ache. Now, he said, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. I know that's not who we are. That's not what I want. He hesitated, then reached for my hand, his touch warm, steady, a quiet promise that made my heart ache. Elise, I don't want to lose what we have, he said, his voice raw, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. But I don't want us to get stuck either. I studied his face, looking for sincerity, for regret, for the man I had built a life with, the man I had loved for 20 years. Then we fix us, I said softly, my voice trembling, a flush creeping up my cheeks as I fought to keep my composure. Not by listening to men like Julian, but by remembering who we are, by choosing each other every single day. Daniel's grip on my hand tightened, his hazel eyes filled with a raw honesty that made my heart ache. I do choose you, he said, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again, a warmth spreading through me as I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder, the scent of his cologne a faint comfort against the storm inside me. Let's never let anyone else define what our marriage should be, I whispered, my voice soft, a warmth spreading through me as I spoke. He kissed the top of my head, his touch warm, steady, a quiet promise that made my heart ache. Agreed, he murmured, his voice low, a warmth in his tone that made my heart ache. The evening stretched on, the tension finally giving way to something softer, something familiar, the city's skyline glittering in the distance, a silent witness to the choice we had made. Julian had planted a seed of doubt, but in the end, it only reminded us of what truly mattered, each other. And as we sat there in silence, the weight of the past week finally lifting, I knew that our love, our choice, would be enough to carry us through.